Miss. Good morning, everyone. I am pleased to welcome you all to the 14th edition of the International Meeting of Studies on the Origins of Contemporary Philosophy held at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo. This event will be held in a hybrid format, online and in person. Every single day, there will be an international keynote speakers online presentation in the mornings, followed by a debate with an invited Brazilian professor. In the afternoon, we will have two conferences, each by a researcher either from our research group or a long-time collaborator. This year's keynote speakers are the professors Maria van der Schaar, Uni Leiden, Juliet Floyd, Boston University, Thomas Übel, University of Manchester, and Mark Textor, King's College London. The debaters will be respectively Marcelo de Carvalho, Unifesp, Mauro Engelmann, UFMG, Lucas Bacará, Universität Wien, and Ernesto Giusti, Unicentro. Our afternoon talks will be delivered by Professor Fréchette, Universität Lisbon, Genève, Professor Boccaccini, Université UNB UFAP, Professor Mauro Engelmann, UFMG, Professor Alice Serra, UFMG, Professor Gabriel Ferreira, Unicinos, Professor Sheila Tomé, URSS, Professor Débora Moreira Guimarães, UERJ, Professor Ernesto Giusti, Unicentro, and myself. Today's opening conference will be delivered by the esteemed Professor Maria van der Schaar. She is well known for her work on logic and the history of analytic philosophy. Professor Schaar's titles and achievements are too vast to be fully enumerated here. So I will sum it up by highlighting that she is currently one of the most influential philosophers on her themes. Professor van der Schaar's lecture will be followed by a discussion with Marcelo de Carvalho, professor at the Federal University of São Paulo. I would like to thank both of them for their participation in this meeting. Further, we are grateful for the support of both the São Paulo Research Foundation, FAPESP, and the graduation program from our university. It was only in virtue of them that it was possible to hold the meeting in its current format. Without further ado, I now invite Professor Schaar to speak.
Thank you very much for your most honorable invitation to present at your research group. I'm very much delighted to be here, although it's online. I'm sorry for that. So let us start with the next slide. So the question I want to discuss with you today is what is the role of the first person indexical as we can find it in the Tractatus. It seems to come in only at the 5.6s. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world, and I am my world. But it seems that we can also see it already at the beginning, at 2.1, in the first pages. We make to ourselves pictures of facts. Or if I can think of an object in the context of a state of affairs, I cannot think of it apart from the possibility of this context. Why does Wittgenstein introduce here the first person indexical? Is that essential? Elsewhere we have the Satz, the sentence or proposition, is a model of reality as we think it is. So what is the role of the first person indexical in such passages? And is there a relation between its use in the fives and the earlier occurrences? Next slide, please. So if we look at the notebooks, in May 2015, more precisely the 23rd, Wittgenstein writes there for the first time with a first-person indexical to be philosophically relevant. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. So, and this is, with this philosophical significance, it seems to be there for the first time. For this theme, we cannot find in 1913 or 14 in the notes on logic and the notes dedicated to Moore. And then the day before, after having received a letter from Russell that Russell couldn't understand Moore's notes, Wittgenstein answers on the 22nd, please next slide. And now I'm afraid that what I've written recently will be still more incomprehensible. And if I don't live to see the end of the war, I must be prepared for all my work to go for nothing. The problems are becoming more and more lapidary and general, and the method has changed thoroughly. So in what sense has Wittgenstein's method changed thoroughly since 1913 and 1914? What makes it now so different from the earlier, apparently more Russellian approach, in the way that Russell couldn't understand what he's doing now? And can we relate it to the role of the first-person indexical in the remark from the notebooks, where Wittgenstein speaks of my language, and where we have to imagine a book, the world as I found it? Next slide. So the structure of my talk is as follows. First, I will ask the question, can we relate the first-person indexical in the limits of my language to this change in method that Wittgenstein announces in May 1915? The conclusion of that first part is that Wittgenstein's new method is thoroughly first-personal. And of course, we have then to understand what that means. I hope, well, at least I have a whole talk about that. But then, if it's first-personal, the method, how is the Tractatus to overcome psychologism? So what's the difference between the first person and the subject? And part 3, does this first-personal method imply a form of transcendental idealism or solipsism? Next slide. So in 1913, there are already first doubts about the Russellian approach to philosophical questions. If we look at the notes on logic, it seems at first that Wittgenstein is following Russell's approach to the question of judgment. He has a kind of external point of view. For Russell, for example, writes, he gives a picture of A and P. A is the subject, judging subject, and P is the proposition, and you have between them, represented by a line, an external relation of judging between the two. Next slide. So, inspired by that, Wittgenstein gives in the notes on logic also analysis of A judges P, but improves slightly on the picture we just saw. There is still the A as a subject, the P as a proposition, but Wittgenstein says there are also two poles, the true and the false, and that's crucial. So the picture is slightly changed, but not essentially. By the way, this is not the one Wittgenstein made. I made it myself yesterday evening and took a picture, so I'm not suggesting anything. Next slide, please. Can this be an accurate analysis of judgment that we just saw in the picture on the account of the 1913 notes? If the sentence or proposition P is one of the terms of the relation of judging, it seems to be nothing but a name. But this would not fit in with Wittgenstein's stress on the distinction between names and sentences. When we say A believes P, this sounds, it is true, as if here we could substitute a proper name for P. Wittgenstein writes, but this can't be right, as Wittgenstein himself, of course, admits. The P has to be a placeholder not for that clauses as names, but for complete sentences, including the verb. So a sentence, well, when Wittgenstein uses the term proposition, it's not in the Russellian meaning as some kind of objective proposition independent of language. For Wittgenstein, proposition is linguistic. So often I will say a sentence, although it is a bit stronger than sentence. Anyway, essential to the proposition or sentence is that it can be true or false. That means it's bipolar, and therefore it cannot be a name. And then Wittgenstein says, judging is obviously not a relation in the ordinary sense. This reminds us of the Tractatus. Here in A thinks P or judges P, it appears superficially as if the proposition P stood to the object A in a kind of relation. Next slide. So we have here a first insight into the problem of Russell's approach. And the picture he himself has proposed as a kind of improvement. He just wanted to show that the P is not just a name, but has two poles. But then if you put it in that picture that we just saw, then there is this problem, because there is a subject A and there is a proposition P, which are presented as a kind of object. And there are just external relations between them. And that can't be right, according to Wittgenstein. So the insight is contained in the following. And it's already in 1913. Every right theory of judgment must make it impossible for me to judge that table penholders the book. Russell's theory does not satisfy this requirement. Well, the nonsense point is clear in the literature, but of course I will soon return to it. What I want you to show now is that there is something else in the remark. Why does Wittgenstein use here the expression "for me"? Why is that relevant? It's the only passage in 1913 where the first person indexical seems to play a certain role with philosophical significance. Next slide. Now, what is precisely the critique of Russell's multiple theory of judgment? And then we'll also understand the nonsense objection. Well, Russell in the Theory of Knowledge manuscript that Wittgenstein knew from 1913, but it also applies to the earlier version that Russell gave in Problems of Philosophy from 1912. Russell gives the general analysis of judgments as follows. He takes for judgment a predicate expression, G, and then we get the objects, S, you have to, is to stand for the logical form of what is judged, and then you get names for the objects. So if we take the judgment by Othello, Othello judges that Desdemona loves Cassio. What do we get? A predicate expression for judges. So that's something like a relation, a functional expression in this presentation. And then we get the arguments. Oh, for Othello, RXI is then the form of the judge, the content of the judgment given by Othello. And DLC. D and C stand for Desdemona and Cassio, but L has to stand in Russell's account for loving as a non-relating relation, loving as a term. Because if it would really relate D and C in that order, then we have a problem for Russell, because it's the objects themselves that occurs as content of the judgment. So then by the fact that Othello makes the judgment, Desdemona would actually love Cassio, and he can't allow for that. So he has to make a distinction here between loving as a really relating relation and just loving as a term. But now we have a problem, because there's no categorical difference between D, C, and L. They're all terms. So that means that Russell's analysis does not exclude that one may judge that love Desdemonizes Cassio, which is nonsense. Actually, Russell gives the same analysis for mere understanding or thinking. It's done with the U of understanding. It's the same form. Next slide. So what would Wittgenstein's answer be? In the analysis of A judges that P, the P has to be a sentence for me, who is attributing the belief to A. But we're not there yet. We first have to answer the question, so what it is for me as the agent, the first person to judge or think. On Russell's external approach to the question of judgment seems to be an external empirical relation between the subject and the proposition, or in the later theory, between a subject and several terms, represented, the judging relation, by a function expression G. So judgment belief for Russell is just a phenomenon in the world. It's something that's to be studied by psychology. But Wittgenstein answers the question of judgment is in need of a first-person agent approach. So Wittgenstein begins to see that there is a problem with Russell's external spectator's approach to philosophical questions. But what would Wittgenstein's own theory of judgment be then? Does he have one? We come back to that later. Next slide. And how does the critique on Russell's account of judgment in Notes on Logic relate to the critique on Russell's conception of logic? Because this is just about judgment, but can we generalize that? Does that hide a deeper problem? Well, in the Principia Mathematica, Russell introduces the assertion sign, indicating that the authors, Russell and Whitehead, assert something. So there, you see, the subject is coming in, according to Wittgenstein. I think rightly so, if we take Russell here to his words. The point is that logic is for Russell science, and the logician is to make assertions about the world, giving the most universal laws, holding of all objects, properties, and relations in the world. Logic has content and a subject matter of its own, negation, implication, identity. But Wittgenstein answers, assertion is merely psychological. The assertion sign is logically quite without significance. So that view is already in 1913 in the Notes on Logic. And that means that the subject A in the picture, remember the picture that I made, that I copied from the Notes on Logic, should play no role in logic. As the Notes on Logic have it, logic cannot treat of a special set of things. Truth and falsity, for example, are not special logical objects or properties. And the negation sign does not refer to a function as a special subject matter of logic. Implication is not a kind of relation in the sense in which being left off is a relation, as we know from the Tractatus. So Wittgenstein writes already in 1912 to Russell, logic must turn out to be of a totally different kind than any other science. Next slide. Now, what is in general the problem with Russell's method? So we've seen some of the problems for judgment when you have the assertion sign in logic. And there is also a problem in the way he conceives of logic, but there is also a general problem, according to Wittgenstein, with Russell's philosophical method. As he writes in the Tagebücher, in the notebooks, Russell's method, in his scientific method in philosophy, that's a subtitle of our knowledge of the external world in 1915, but it's also the title of a pamphlet made from a lecture from that year. Wittgenstein writes, it's simply a retrogression from the method of physics. The problem is thus not just that Russell sees logic as a science. Russell considers the true method of philosophy to be continuous with the empirical scientific method. As Wittgenstein writes, the word philosophy ought always to designate something over or under, but not beside the natural sciences. Philosophy can neither confirm nor confute scientific investigation. So philosophy and psychology have nothing to do with each other. They should be clearly separated. Next slide. So do we have another example of such a first-person methodology where it's more clearly not only in judgment, but also, or logic, but also elsewhere plays a role? Well, in this same remark from May 1915, there is such an example of an agent's approach to a philosophical question. It's in a quote that we also repeated in the Tractatus. In the book, The World as I Found It, I should also have to report on my body and say which members are subject to my will. For this is a method of isolating the subject, or rather, of showing that in an important sense, there is no such thing as a subject. for it would be the one thing that could not come into this book. Paradoxically, the first person indexical is in the title of the book, whereas the method is to show that there is no subject. Apparently, the first person method does not allow for a subject. The I in the title is not to refer to an empirical subject. As we will see later, it's not a referring term at all. Next slide. And then also in May 1915, so when you can see kind of turn in the Tagebücher and in the letter to Russell, where Wittgenstein writes about the limits of language, mean the limits of my language, mean the limits of my world, as we just saw at the beginning. And then he asks a few days later, but is language the only language? Why should there not be a mode of expression through which I can talk about language? I myself only write sentences down here. And why? How is language unique? The point is that there is no other language that I can use to ask philosophical questions about the language I use. As the Tractatus puts it, the language that one uses and understands, that language one cannot go beyond, is my language, the language of the first person. The Tractatus is only concerned with the essence of language. It neglects all conventional differences. I come back to that point later. But that means that the limits of my language can be understood as the limits of language, if you just look at the essence of language. Philosophical questions concerning the limits of language and thought are asked by someone who is already using the language. They are essentially asked from within, that is, within language, because you cannot go beyond that, beyond your own language, which is the language. Next slide. So for Wittgenstein, if we could look at the Tractatus, philosophy should limit the unthinkable from within, from innen, through the thinkable. It will mean, bedeuten, the unspeakable by clearly displaying the speakable, das Saagbare. So questions of logic relate to one's own language as the language. That's the idea that you have to understand the language from within, that has always to be your own language. Russell, in contrast, asks what it is for Othello to judge. So he looks at somebody else's language and not somebody else's judgment. He just takes an external spectator's point of view when asking the philosophical question, what judgment is. For Russell, philosophical questions are on a par with empirical scientific questions. He understands judgment as something in the world, which you can describe from an external point of view. For Russell, logic itself is a science and is to provide a special, exact language for science. So it's also something that's external to our own language, to one's own language. You create a new language, especially for science. So that's very different from Wittgenstein's approach. So next slide. So what we see here at the beginning of a new method that Wittgenstein is proposing, around 1915 in May, a criticism of Russell's external approach to judgment, a book that we have to imagine, that's something that you have to do yourself, to imagine the book. That's a kind of first-person method. And in the questions of logic and language and the limits of thought, it's also a first-person question because it concerns your own language and the logic of your own language. So we can now understand Wittgenstein's remark in the letter to Russell from May 1915 that we started with, that his method has changed thoroughly. So we have on the one hand Russell's ideal of a scientific method, philosophy in line with psychology, a spectator's approach, opposed to Wittgenstein's internal first-person method, an agent's approach. So let us go to part 2, this next slide. So we have to address then the problem of psychologism, because there is, of course, a very close relation somehow for all of us between the first person and the subject. Am I not both a first person and a subject? How does this work? Well, Wittgenstein himself also sees it as a problem. Does not my study of sign language correspond to the study of thought processes which philosophers held to be so essential to the philosophy of logic? Only they got entangled, for the most part, in unessential psychological investigations, and there is an analogous danger for my method. So yeah, he sees the danger. And also, sometimes when we use passages from the notebooks, that can also be dangerous, because sometimes they might be misleading. For example, if we take an earlier passage from before May 1915, we see, by my correlating the components of the picture with objects, it comes to represent the situation and to be right or wrong. What could be wrong with this? So we will see it in the next slide, please. Why could this be misleading? Well, it suggests that objects and names are given independently of each other, so that the question arises how names and objects are related. Now, my correlating the two would then be an external empirical relation between them. Names and objects are given independently of the relation, so that's an external relation. And we have then a danger of psychologism, because the relating that we then do would be an event in the world that we could describe with a function expression. But that would contradict the view in the Tractatus, and it has a reason that the remark is not to be found there. Names as primitive signs are internally related to the simple objects they stand for. These names and their reference come to us together through the language we use. They are the result of analysis of complete sentences in use, not starting points. The notion of a symbol, a sign in use, a sign with a meaning, is in the Tractatus prior to that of sign. The sign is that aspect of the symbol that can be perceived by the senses. So a name is only an aspect of a symbol. We cannot understand it without a symbol. So it's already essentially related to its object. What is an internal relation? Well, Wittgenstein was well aware what it means, because we can find it in More. An internal relation is essential to or constitutive of the identity of the object related. I have to come back to that theme of internal relations at the end of my talk, and we will there see that Wittgenstein gives a different explanation of internal relation. Next slide. In what sense can we understand that names are internally related to their object? Because it's not any name, it's not that my name, that I could have had another name. Maybe it's difficult to imagine now that I'm having this age already, but when I was very young, you could imagine that I would have had a different name. But Wittgenstein says names as primitive signs, so my name, Maria van der Schaar, is just certainly not a primitive sign. Names as primitive signs that cannot be further analyzed are internally related to their objects. It's important to understand that the Tractatus makes a distinction between essential and accidental features of a sentence. Accidental are the features which are due to a particular way of producing the propositional sign. That explains the differences in the different languages for rain, regen. Essential are those which alone enable the proposition, the Satz, to express its sense. And the real name in German says der eigentliche Name, like proper primitive name, is that which all symbols which can fulfill the same purpose have in common. And the purpose of a name is then to name a certain object. There's nothing else. It doesn't have a content like as in Frege. It just stands for an object. The philosopher, Wittgenstein says, is interested only in the essential features. All the rest is convention and association and is of interest to the psychologist. So the philosopher is not to give an account of that a certain name, like my name, stands for me. It is the real name, the eigentliche Name, that has the internal relation of bedeuten to its object. Next slide. It also helps if you see that the context principle plays an important role in the Tractatus. That makes it also a bit more easy to digest what Wittgenstein means by this internal relation. The context principle, first look at context principle in Frege, that Wittgenstein knew very well. It's from the Grundlage. Frege writes, if the second principle, that is the context principle, in the introduction to the Grundlage, is not observed, one is almost forced to take as the meanings of words mental pictures or acts of the individual mind, and so to offend against the first principle as well. Well, the first principle is to separate the psychological from the logical. Or in Wittgenstein's case, if one asks about the reference of names independently of the sentence in which they occur, one seems forced to assume that there is a psychological relation between the names and the objects they stand for. The point is that we have to see how the name is used in the significant sentence, and in all the sentences it can occur. For the primitive name as symbol comes with its logical syntactic application. So a proper name that I just gave as an example is perhaps not so good an example of a name. You can also think of puntje puntje loves puntje puntje, because the names have to come with certain holes in them, as we have seen it in Frege, as though they're function expressions or something like that. How otherwise could the names form a sentence which says something? How otherwise could the objects in a state of affairs be like links in the chain? That would of course not be possible if we would imagine these objects to be just independently existing atoms. Next slide. So we have now an idea of this internal relation between name and object. If we now go back to Wittgenstein's own analysis of judgment, then what we see in just before the 5.6, we see something happening there. He takes over, it seems as though he's taking over Russell's external approach, because he says, I'm going to analyze Satzformen der Psychologie, so forms of sentences or propositions that are part of our psychology, and that can be studied by psychology, such as A believes that P is the case. So Wittgenstein writes there, A judges P has the form, P says P. So in this case, the subject A has disappeared. And what is also relevant, what stands on the left side of says needs to have the same complexity as what stands on the right side of says. For the elements in each have to be correlated in order that P says P. So the first P in that formula, P says P, describes the picture fact in A, but A self has disappeared. It's only his thought, that P, that is described by this first P. And the second one is the fact that P. So what we see here in this analysis that Wittgenstein gives, the judging subject as empirical subject has disappeared. So that's correct, because for Wittgenstein, Russell's analysis of judgment is infected by psychologism, and that's also a problem if judgment is then to play a role in logic. Second, Russell's analysis does not exclude that one may judge that love and Desdemona is Cassio, which is nonsense. We've already seen that, and Wittgenstein is not so explicit here in the Tractatus about it, but he repeats the criticism. And third, you have to note that the P has to be a sentence in the attributor's language. So if I'm saying A judges P, and I then give analysis P says P, I'm the attributor. I'm the one who's using the language. So the P has to be a sentence in my language. That is the attributor. I'm attributing a judgment to A. And of course, A disappears in the analysis. So the P has to be a sentence in the attributor's language, the one who uses the language, who says A judges P. But Russell does not ask the question what it is for me to judge or think. I remember the notebook point. Of course, Wittgenstein is not very explicit about these points. And you would say, well, is this then Wittgenstein's analysis of judgment? I don't think so. Next slide. The analysis of belief attribution in the 5.54s presuppose an understanding of what a sentence is in one's own language. But that means that Wittgenstein already has given his own theory of judgment. He didn't mention the term, he only mentioned the term thought. I'm here in line with James Griffin's early book, who writes, here in the threes, we have Wittgenstein's own theory of judgment. It's to be found in the threes quite early, where Wittgenstein explains the thought, der zinvolle Satz. Only when we have explained the thought or judgment can we understand what attributing judgment is to someone else. So, of course, this had to be earlier in the threes, because before he does the attribution in 5.54. But can Wittgenstein give an account of thought or judgment without falling into psychologism? Because that was our question. Well, if we see the way he presents the thought, der zinvolle Satz, there is no empirical subject needed as a term to be related by judging to a proposition. No subject is needed to assert something. In a certain sense, assertions do not play they do play a certain role, but not an essential role in the Tractatus. No empirical subject is needed to relate name and object. Both are already there in the symbol. And no subject is needed to unify the terms of the proposition in the right order, as Russell needed to do, in order to count for the unity or sense of the proposition. So this is already in the threes. Next slide. But how then precisely is judging nonsense excluded by the threes? Well, there is simply no way to construct a sentence in a non-logical way, for the names in the sentences come already with their possibility to be combined with other names in the sentences. There is thus no way to combine them the wrong way. As the names are internally related to the objects as the referent, these objects come with the same possibilities to combine. In this way, the sentence as a connection of names is essentially already a picture of a possible state of affairs. And there is no task left for the subject as the language already is in order. Logic must take care of itself, as Wittgenstein writes several times. So how can Wittgenstein's account of thought in the threes be an account of judgment? Because it doesn't mention the term judgment there. Well, it's a bit for debate, but I think that every significant sentence, at least that's what he says, already says something. A freestanding, simple sentence, der Elementarsatz, asserts something. In German it says, behauptet das Bestehen eines Sachverhaltes, and behaupten is to assert. But then, what do we do with a non-assertive occurrence of an elementary sentence as antecedent of a conditional? For these are certainly not asserted. Well, they have to be understood in a deviant, as a deviant use. Clearly, the sharp distinction between the assertive and the non-assertive use is so important with Frege's Begriffsschrift, and also plays a role in Russell's Principia. And the corresponding distinction between judgment and thought is not acknowledged in the Tractatus. Next slide. So what we see, I hope that you agree, that Wittgenstein's account of judgment, the sentence in use, is not infected with psychologism. At least if we follow the line of the story just given. But if language is my language, and if a first-person method is essential to the Tractatus, how are we to understand the first person? As long as the idea of a first person is not clear, the first-person methodology may be tainted by psychologism or subjectivism. So we still don't have a full answer to the question of part one. So unless we also are able to answer these questions. Next slide. So we come now to the third part. To what extent is there a form of transcendental idealism in the Tractatus? And would that then imply something about a transcendental ego? And how would we then have to understand that? Okay, that's incumbent on an empirical subject, but what would it then precisely be for Wittgenstein? And there's also a problem of solipsism in the Tractatus. So the question is, what does the I do there in the 5.6s? What does it mean? Well, some people have, of course, written about this before, and not just McGuinness and McGinn, and we can talk about that later in the discussion. But it's important to understand because sometimes in the notebooks, Wittgenstein says things like the I is, it talks about the world soul. But I don't think that in the Tractatus that the I is a world soul. Certainly not a world soul in which different subjects then could participate. Because then we have a question, what's the relation between subject? Is that an empirical subject? And what is the relation then with that one with the world soul? And I don't think that the world can be identified with the neutral intersubjective state of affairs, as though we all have a certain kind of perspective on the world. It's simply not the case that there are different first persons, as though we have here a concept that would make it possible to count. Numbers don't apply here. Nor does the first person bring in a point of view so that we would be able to speak of different points of views on the world. That's not the way you have to think about it. The first person in its purified form is impersonal. There are no characteristics so that we could say, here's the first person. The I in its first personal use has no meaning. It does not refer. It's not part of, and the first person is not part of the world. Well, is there then not some personal element in the Tractatus? Yes, of course there is. One's path to a clear view, if we see it in the Tractatus, is personal. There are certain philosophical demons for Wittgenstein, and maybe they are the same as we have, the way we have them. Maybe not as strongly. Solipsism is, of course, has a very strong attraction for Wittgenstein. So how's going to deal with them? Next slide. So let's begin with transcendental idealism. So if you look at the notebooks, you see that the transcendental reflections only appear after he has talked about the limits of my language, mean the limits of my world. So he begins to understand that this first person, is not to be understood in empirical terms, and maybe we can understand them in transcendental terms. Now, the notebooks are much more Kantian and given in transcendental terms than the Tractatus. So I think in the Tractatus there's more distance, but it plays absolutely a very important role in the background because a transcendental question is the central question in the Tractatus. Given that there is language, that is language consisting of symbols, through which something is said about the world. What are its necessary conditions? That's a transcendental question. And what is the answer? Well, there are two necessary conditions, at least. The first person is also one, but at first sight, we have only two. Identity of logical form between picture and what is pictured, and the internal relation between name and object. But the problem is that neither of these necessary conditions can be formulated in sentences. And we can also not talk about the first person, if that is also a necessary condition for a language, for saying something about the world. Next slide. Now, both, I think that it's not to deny that both Kantianism and Neo-Kantianism play a role in the background. It was completely part of the cultural background in Vienna at that time. Whether you discussed it with your intelligent sister or with friends, it always came up. And there are certain Neo-Kantian elements in the Tractatus. It's not the main theme today, but we can mention just a few: the anti-psychologism, the priority of judgment over concepts, the philosophy of science there with the different nets. There's no distinction between appearances and things in themselves, just as we see that in the Neo-Kantians. But there is such an important difference with the Neo-Kantians, because the quest for the Neo-Kantians, people like Windelband and Rickert, is the quest for the validity of knowledge, the idea that truth is a value. And of course, I don't speak about the more psychologistic Neo-Kantians like Erdmann and Fries, Erdmann, we know from Frege, he's not even discussing them because it's anyway out of the question. And he knew that because Frege already had shown that. But it's difficult to see Wittgenstein as a new Kantian because it doesn't have this quest for the validity of knowledge. And at moments, it seems to be more helpful to see Wittgenstein as a Kantian. The idea of the unity of subject and world that is mediated by Schopenhauer's writings somehow is in the background. Not in precisely that way, of course, because there is also language. And also the focus on limit and necessary conditions, that's a truly Kantian theme. But the question in the Tractatus concerns the limits of language and thought. And that gives a unique turn to the transcendental question, for we cannot express in language the necessary conditions of language and thought as relating to the world, for we cannot distance ourselves from language and thought. Wittgenstein's critique of language is essentially different from Kant's critique of reason. Next slide. So we have here a problem. We cannot say anything about the identical logical form in the picture. And what is pictured? Given that the identical logical form is a necessary condition for language. There are no truths with content that could express the a priori conditions for the possibility of language and thought. There's no synthetic a priori. Kant's critique of pure reason can thus not simply be turned into a critique of language. There's no content to be known, and there's only one judgmental form, the general form of the Satz. So and so is the case. The point is that the limit has to be understood from the inside, through the construction of sentences. There's no way in which we could construct the elementary sentences the wrong way, for the names come with their possibilities to connect. We've seen that already, and are essentially related to the objects they name that come with the same possibilities to connect the states of affairs. Each non-elementary construction we can foresee by means of the formal operations that apply to the elementary sentences. Next slide. No transcendental ego is needed as a prior form of unity that makes all judgmental unity possible, nor is the Kantian I think needed, which may accompany all one's thinking and judging, unifying our judgment and thoughts by my realizing that these thoughts are my thoughts. No story is needed to account for the unity of one's thoughts and thereby of oneself as the agent of that unity. For the less Kantian among us, the same point can be made in Fregean terms. In the Tractatus, no judgment stroke is needed to unify the assertions made in the Begriffsschrift as forming one logical system. Nor is it needed to assert something, for the primary use of an elementary sentence is already to make an assertion. The unity is already there internal to the language, that is nothing but my language, the language I use and understand. The first person seems somehow to be internal to the language. Next slide. So we've come now to a kind of, there's not really transcendental idealism in the Tractatus. Of course, it's a certain way of thinking. It goes a lot with it, with this idea of the limit, a critique of language, but somehow the transcendental ego is empty. And that seems even to bring in a form of solipsism, and it is also there. Look at 5.63 and the next 5.641. I am my world, and the world is my world. So if that is in the sense of identity, that means I am the world. So, and it is solipsism if we read it from right to left, then the world reduces to I, and there's nothing but the I. We have metaphysical solipsism. But you can also read it from left to right, as David Bell has proposed. The left to right reading corresponds with the idea of an empty ego that we found in Wittgenstein utter consequence of transcendental idealism. So nothing is left of the I in this solipsism where we read it from left to right, which collapses to realism. So Wittgenstein's solipsism, strictly carried out, coincides with pure realism. I is not a referring expression. There's no object that can be named. The I has no substantial content, unless you say it's the whole world. But there's nothing like the whole world that we can talk about, because we cannot step outside the world. But this seems to leave us empty-handed regarding the first person in the Tractatus. Now we have a problem. Next slide. Are we empty-handed? Well, we've somehow overcome the division of I and world. We have submitted ourselves to the world, in the line of the Tractatus. And this has important consequences for the question how to live. Gottfried Gabriel has a paper, Solipsism, the Leitmotif in Wittgenstein's Philosophy, that's the title. And there he says the I in the Tractatus is the author. But this is only partly correct. You have to remember a tale of love and darkness written by Amos Oz some 20 years ago. He says it's not the distance between what is written and the author that needs to be plowed, but the distance between what is written and you the reader. You have to imagine to be, say, in Raskolnikov's place. So the I in the Tractatus has the role of author and reader. The Tractatus demands a first-person engagement of the reader to overcome one's own philosophical demons. Next slide. Language and world are internally related for a first person as a necessary condition. It's a first person's language and world. So it's your own language and world. The main point, though, is to understand the idea of the first person as part of a first person methodology. That's why I started with this new method as first part of the talk. The internal relations we talked about then play a central role in the Tractatus as a relation between language and world, name and object, and as logical relations between propositions, Sätze. Such a relation can only be understood as first personal, the internal relation. So what does this mean? Next slide. Let me first give a more simple example, understanding. Miles Burnett has written a very beautiful paper on Augustine's De Magistro. No man ever does or can teach another anything, Augustine writes. What? Nothing can be taught? Well, says Miles Burnett, Augustine speaks of knowledge as understanding. What cannot be taught is understanding. That's a form of non-propositional knowledge. Understanding is something one can only do by oneself. It is first personal. And some things cannot be taught. And as Wittgenstein, of course, wants to say, philosophy belongs there. It's kein Lehrbuch. Next slide. So how can we then understand internal relations in terms of being first personal? For at first sight, it doesn't seem to be a first personal notion at all. An internal relation is in some way, as we've seen at the beginning, essential to or constitutive of the identity of the objects related. Or as Wittgenstein put it in the past, the relations of logical consequence exist as soon as and by the very fact that the sentences exist. It is an important point for Wittgenstein that the subject has nothing to do here but to look at the sentences. So what about the first person then? Well, if you look at Wittgenstein's account of their internal relations, that does make use of a first personal method. Look, 4.123. A property is internal if it is unthinkable that its object does not possess it. And if two objects stand in an internal relation, it is unthinkable that these two objects should not stand in this relation. So you have to imagine what you can think and what you cannot think. And that is something that you have to do as a first person. And it's not that somebody can say, write it explicitly down in further true sentences. No, you can't. This is where it stops. Here you have to do it yourself. Next slide. Logical relations as internal relations, recognizing logical relations is like understanding first personal. So the non-elementary sentences are ordered in a series which are ordered through internal relations. Now, every sentence is the result of successive applications of an operation upon elementary sentences. The logical relations, the internal relations between these sentences, can be recognized by us because we ourselves are able to construct the non-elementary sentences from the elementary ones by the successive application of the operations. We can thus recognize these internal relations between sentences if they are formulated in a perspicuous language. We can recognize the formal properties of the sentences by the mere look of these sentences. We can recognize the tautologies am symbol allein, just from the symbol. Such a recognition is essentially first personal and non-propositional. In a logical perspicuous language, no inference rules are needed. Logic takes care of itself. The mere inspection of the sentences that function as premises and conclusion makes one see that the inference is valid. We would not be able to see all this if the logically perspicuous language would not be one's own language. We were there already from the beginning as the user of the language, as a first person who constructs these non-elementary sentences by which we can see these relations. Next slide. So in a certain sense, we could conclude Wittgenstein's first-person method can be understood as a radicalization of Frege's method. For Frege's Begriffsschrift demands a first-person engagement as well. The reader is to demonstrate and assert the logical laws in order to be entitled to use them. He has to see that modus ponens is valid for him. A proof has to be a proof for me. But for Frege, the first-person engagement is conditional on our making judgment, on our aiming to know the laws of logic, which are the laws of judgment. For example, in fiction, it wouldn't mind that the laws of logic do not count there. But because Wittgenstein's logic is a logic of the whole of language, it comes out different. In the Tractatus, an unconditional first-person engagement is demanded, as its aim is to understand the logic of one's own language. Furthermore, the path of purification that we have described is for Wittgenstein a spiritual path. Understanding the logic of language makes us understand that the meaning of life cannot be found in the world. It has to consist in the way the first person relates to the world. The question how to live is a question of how I should relate to the world as a whole. Ethics, like understanding, is also first personal. This means that, like understanding, the ethical cannot be taught, as Wittgenstein writes. The aim of the Tractatus is fulfilled, I think Wittgenstein would write elsewhere, when the reader finally understands that there is nothing left but to live one's life unconditionally. Thank you very much. The end.
Thank you very much, Professor van der Schaar. We'll now have the comments by Professor Marcelo. Thank you, Professor, for coming. Please turn on the
Okay. Good morning. I suppose it's good afternoon to Professor van der Schaar. I'm very pleased for being here with you. My sincere congratulations to Professor Mario Porta and his team for organizing this noteworthy event. Thank you, Arthur, for your patience with me. I'm very grateful for the invitation. I'm delighted also to engage in a discussion with Professor van der Schaar's work, which provides a significant and innovative perspective on Wittgenstein's Tractatus, what is not few, given the volume of works on the Tractatus, as well as its connections to the notebooks and the lectural networks. In the forthcoming discussion, I aim to propose some questions and explore the themes that constitute that contribute to a deeper understanding of her work and Wittgenstein's philosophy. To begin with, in sections 5.541 to 5.5422 of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein's remarks move with very few steps from a critique of Russell's theory of judgment to asserting the simplicity of the soul. This rapt and unexpected movement imposes a considerable demand on the reader. Professor van der Schaar proposes a meticulous and persuasive analysis, elucidating what she terms the first-person method employed by Wittgenstein in the Tractatus. I suggest that we revisit this theme to consider some aspects of Wittgenstein's understanding of the role of the first person. Russell conceives a judgment as a relationship between a subject, the elements of judgment, and its form, as was shown by Professor van der Schaar. It implies describing judgment from an external point of view. The judging subject is considered a constituent part of it. From Wittgenstein's perspective, Russell's theory of judgment fails to address the issue of understanding judgment as the act that establishes the projective relationship between language and the word. That Othello believes Desdemona loves Cassio, observed from a distance, is simply another fact. From the Tractarian point of view, however, a judgment, made here by Othello, is not itself a fact, but rather the projective relationship between two facts. The proposition, which is itself a fact. The proposition that is itself a fact, proposition P, and the fact P on the other side. The judging subject performs this projection from one fact to another by thinking the sense of the proposition. The subject is not, therefore, an empirical part of the proposition, but a transcendental condition for it. This projective relationship is, therefore, ineffable and cannot be described in the way Russell intends to do, as pointed out by Professor van der Schaar. The same holds for the subject of thinking and judgment. Professor van der Schaar's analysis clarifies that understanding Russell's mistake is not being able, Russell's mistake, what is his mistake? Not being able to present the role of the judging subject. It implies unfolding in a first step in the assertion that, I quote, A says P is the form of P says P, as Wittgenstein presents that, where there is no reference to the judging subject. And after that, understanding Russell's mistake unfolds in the conclusion that there is no such thing as the soul, the two steps in Wittgenstein's analysis. Wittgenstein's critique of Russell implies that the subject conceived from a first-person perspective, as described by Professor van der Schaar, is not something within the world. The perspective from the first person is, according to Professor van der Schaar, the new and central movement made by Wittgenstein in the Tractatus. The preceding analysis elucidates that a subject that is not part of the world is a transcendental condition for any assertion and judgment. As a result, the subject is ineffable. Wittgenstein characterizes it as the limit of the world. I'd like to say, by side, that this perspective about transcendental subject in the Tractatus aligns with the thesis put forth by Professor João Virgílio Coulter, a professor at the the University of São Paulo and a former professor here at PUC São Paulo, whose arguments and papers greatly contributed to my understanding of the place of the subject in the Tractatus and Tractatus in general. Well, back to my analysis. Instead of arriving at what I believe to be the same conclusions, my description of Wittgenstein's conceptions is not exactly the same proposed by Professor van der Schaar. The reason for that is that I'd like to emphasize an aspect of paragraph 2.1 of the Tractatus, another paragraph that is called out to our attention by Professor van der Schaar. In it, Wittgenstein says that, I quote, "We make pictures of facts to ourselves." Wir machen uns Bilder der Tatsachen. Before this paragraph in the Tractatus, we find in the book, what we find in the book is a kind of ontological description of the world that, I quote, divides into facts. The famous beginning paragraphs of the Tractatus. With no reference in this part of the book to picture, language, or subject. Wittgenstein chooses not initiating his book with a presentation of language or the self. Moreover, the statement, "we picture facts," is introduced as a possibility within the framework of the world conceived as a totality of facts. We use facts to picture other facts that have the same logical form. Before this action, there is no language or picture in the world. The structure of Wittgenstein's argument seems at first clear. The world is a totality of facts. Facts have logical form. A fact may be used as picture of another fact that have the same logical form. But that presupposes the projection of one fact on another. That presupposes thinking. There is no language without the thinking that projects one fact, a proposition, into another fact, its sense. That makes clear the presupposition of a self that plays a transcendental role. But what does this subject do? The arbitrariness of its actions is strongly circumscribed. It projects one fact into another that has the same logical form. Choosing among alternative facts to use as picture seems to be an almost irrelevant decision that do not impact the structure of language itself. The logical form is fixed from the beginning. The meaning of names are fixed, leaving no room for arbitrary human intervention. As a result, the subject is but a formal condition to language, without any impact on the resulting picture of the world. We should notice also that the Tractatus does not present thinking and the thinking subject as a transcendental condition to the world. Instead, it seems to propose the inverse relationship. The world, being a totality of facts, restricts what we may do and what language may be. It's not easy to conciliate the Tractatus beginning with a Kantian question for the transcendental conditions of language, instead of the strong tradition of reading the book from a Kantian perspective. In the end, I suppose what I describe aligns with Professor van der Schaar's speech. The transcendental subject is empty. The self appears to be present from the beginning. It's not part of the world, but it acts upon it. Yet, this subject is devoid of relevance and content. Even when we assert that a name has meaning only in the context of its use, the term use here pertains not to the everyday use we make as everyday use made by a person, but comprehend all the possible uses of the name, encompassing every conceivable relationship with other names. The subject performs a singular function, projecting a fact onto another that shares the same logical form. It is always present, but it is always void. The subject is not a person. How could it be comprehended as me or us in an ethical sense? How can it be happy or unhappy, to quote the Tractatus? I quote 5.641, the philosophical self is not the human being. Comprehending human being, rather than illuminated by the transcendental subject presupposed by language, seems to demand a further step that appears to align more closely with how we face and live the absence of any mention to a subject in the book titled The World as I Found It. It seems to be more in our reaction to understand that than in the transcendental subject that's pointed out in the beginning of the book. To find ourselves, actual persons, diverse people, at the heart of the logical structure of language, we need to turn our attention to another phase in Wittgenstein's development, to what comes as a consequence of his departure from the Tractatus, encountering him anew in the philosophical investigations. Thank you. I hope Professor van der Schaar could follow my speech. I don't know if it was clear.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Professor van der Schaar, do you want to reply to Professor Marcelo? Do you have comments on his talk?
Well, I've found the remarks he made very convincing. It was more like somewhat more anti-Kantian, I assume. And it's of course clear that the realism at the beginning is so evident that, but then of course you have a problem what you're going to do with what is later in the Tractatus. It comes like such a surprise. But of course and Wittgenstein himself says he's a realist, because he says solipsism collapses to realism. It's kind of transcendental realism. Would you, if that is not already a term that's used by others, but because don't you see that there is a transcendental question in the Tractatus somehow? And wouldn't that mean if transcendental idealism is kind of empty because the ego is empty, it doesn't do anything, that in the end it's a form of, let's say, a combination of realism, transcendental idealism, transcendental realism? Would that be something that you would like?
Okay. I suppose I should use both.
Yeah, please.
Yes. It's clear the appeal of reading the Tractatus as a Kantian argument. I suppose that if we go to the notebooks, in the notebooks we find a more Kantian structure in organizing his reasonings, and it seems quite plausible to do that. But there's something that I try to call our attention here, that the author of the Tractatus, to quote Wittgenstein's later way of talking about it, the author of the Tractatus chooses to start the book not asking for the transcendental conditions of language or anything else. It starts describing the word. And more than that, the way he describes the word puts us in the following situation. That's what I suppose is determinant and happens at 2.1 in the book. At 2.1, we may look at the word that was described, and we see that there's no language in there, there's no picture in there. So there is this us that he says, we make pictures of the word. We picture the word. The word make, that is in in German is fundamental, but there is an action that is done by these subjects in the plural. And so what we do when we picture the word is restricted by the beginning of the book. What's the word? The word is a totality of facts. All we can do is use one fact to picture another fact that has the same logical form. My point is that the way language is presented in Tractatus from 2.1 on takes within its core the description of the world as a totality of facts that comes before that. So it's quite understanding the way Wittgenstein organizes the book. It's difficult not to understand that he was saying that language is that way because the world is a totality of facts, and not the opposite way, which is the Kantian question, saying that, wow, that's language. What are its conditions, or what's necessary to language be the way it is? So I understand the Kantian reading. It's the elements seem to be there. There is one paragraph in the book before 2.1 that points in that direction. That 2.0211, if the word has no substance, then whether a proposition has sense would depend on whether another proposition was true. This seems to be a transcendental argument, in fact, to point against what I'm saying. But I understand that is a marginal remark because he's talking about concepts that were not yet presented at that point. And so, well, that's my point about a Kantian reading. I understand its appeal, but I suppose that Wittgenstein was pointing in another direction. And I suppose it's relevant to understand that he is not organizing the book in the form of a Kantian question.
Yeah, but how do we then have to understand the I and the my? Shouldn't we say that the I is non-empirical? And if you say that the I is non-empirical, what else can you mean then talking about a transcendental ego?
Yeah, I fully agree with you. In fact, instead of not supposing that there is a transcendental argument, and I think that what we find is a transcendental role that's played by the I in this. This role is projection, thinking. The sense of a proposition is what connects. There are two facts. That was another point I stressed. There are two facts. One fact that I will use as a proposition. The other fact that is its sense, is a fact in the word that I picture through the proposition. But what connects these two facts? I understand it's my thinking, not my as an empirical person. I fully agree. I suppose I fully agree with your description. My point is here that I suppose we can understand that transcendental role, or we may even say a transcendental subject with some care. I suppose we can do that, but that does not imply that the book is organized as a transcendental question about the conditions for language. And beyond that, there is a point that I may present to you, if you excuse me, as a question that I suppose you connect the transcendental subject that we agree can be found in the description of language in the beginning of the book with the ethical subject in the final paragraphs of the book. But Wittgenstein says in the end of the book that the world of the happy is different from the world of the unhappy. And attributing these ethical qualifiers, being happy, being unhappy, instead of clearly being pointed to something that is connected with this transcendental subject, the idea of the limit of the world, seems to be in contrast with the description of this subject, this ego, as void, as empty. If we have an empty subject playing the role of a transcendental subject in the beginning, how can we say that this subject is the ethical subject that is happy or unhappy? There seems to be, to me, a tension between these later attributions and the emptiness identified in the analysis.
Yes, you're absolutely right. You have to make a distinction there, because it becomes also clear if you read the lectures on ethics, and especially the discussion afterwards, where Wittgenstein talks about the personal experiences, that kind of religious experience about the meaning of life, the feeling absolutely safe. And then he says something like, oh, at least it counts for me. Others may have other experiences. So here you see quite clearly that regarding the ethical subject, there is a personal element involved. And that is truly, you're absolutely right, that gives a tension with the idea of an empty transcendental ego in the case of the question of the necessary conditions of language. So I think you're right, we have to make a distinction there. You cannot just go on and say, well, and there you have the same first person, as I did, in fact, in the talk. And if actually it is much more subtle than that. And that also means that I don't have a clear answer on that. I try to do it in a way that I said, well, there are certainly personal demons. And when we purify the ego, then we have to free ourselves from certain demons, and that might differ from person to person. And you might also perhaps say that, okay, in the Tractatus, not in later in the lectures on ethics, it might seem that the way we have to deal with the world from the point of view of the meaning of life, we have to be like the happy person. That is the way to accept life unconditionally. It seems that in the Tractatus, he allows for some non-personal element in this ethical subject. But later on, he clearly contradicts it in 1929. So, I don't know. Yeah. So you're absolutely right that there is a tension there. But there is also certain agreement, because it's about something that is non-empirical. You can compare the two, but how they're related, you don't know. So, yeah, I don't have the answer. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry to go further on that, because your remark on our demons is quite interesting, because I see in that a way to deal with Wittgenstein's position in the Tractatus, that it's the question seems to be in the final remarks on how we, proper persons, effective persons, we in our lives deal with understanding the emptiness and the role, the empty role played by the transcendental subject. The contradiction understanding that being a subject in the proper sense means implies that emptiness by one side, and being ourselves in the world, in contrast, implies in some way being part of the world, and so being the place of the objects, to refer to Russell's analysis. And so I suppose the way you present that points to find the ethical problem in this tension between the way, this tension in seeing us as proper persons and seeing the role of the transcendental subject. Well, whatever, I thought about that reading your paper, listening to you, and so I'd like just to present that to you. I don't know if you want to react anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so I would like to ask our audience if there are any questions to be posed to Professor van der Schaar and her talk. Professor, yeah, please. Yeah, you have to come here so she can see you. Yeah.
Por aqui.
All right, is it working? Yes. Actually, it's a very short question. First of all, thank you very much, Professor van der Schaar and Professor Carvalho. I'd like to ask a question because I was thinking, which kind of role does the history play in this ontological description of Tractatus? Because, for example, when I think of this relation between the names and the things, the objects they stand for, I think that we're asking, of course, we're asking for the conditions, the necessary conditions of language. But first of all, we're asking for the necessary conditions of meaning, of Bedeutung. And meaning, I mean, it seems to me that it has this historical measure that is beyond the subject. So it means that, for example, in my point of view, if this meaning, this language has historical measure, the subject would be like an empty reference. So I'd like to know, for example, what about the language? What about the connection between language and history in this kind of ontological description? So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question. Well, in a certain sense, Wittgenstein and Tractatus is the prototypical ahistorical philosopher. And the language he's talking about is not the historical language that has grown, but he's talking about the essential aspects. He would probably, well, that's my answer, he would consider the relation that language has to history, that it's grown in a certain way, as he later does, speaks about, that he abstracts from that and goes to the pure, what is needed to have language, that it's just that the name stands for an object, and the name is not even something that we can, it's more like it's somehow deep beneath the surface of our language, that we have there those eigentliche Namen, those real names that immediately stand for object and that necessarily have an object, because in our ordinary language we can talk about Ulysses, and we don't know whether there was ever somebody who was Ulysses. So it's such an ahistorical approach that you can understand that the later Wittgenstein is somehow studied by completely different philosophers with interested in different questions, because precisely in the later Wittgenstein, you see that the language is historical, that the human being is considered to be historical. So, but the Tractatus, I don't know for sure, of course, whether you meant this kind of answer, whether I understood your question well.
Thanks a lot, Professor. Yes, I was thinking about this historical approach, and so thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Do we have any more questions? Professor Frechette. Professor van der Schaar, Professor Guillaume Frechette has a question. I'd ask him to please come.
Hello, hello, Maria.
Hello, Guillaume.
Nice to see you. Well, I mean, I have to turn my back there to see you, but so
Yeah.
I'll try to look there, although you're not there. This is weird, but I should get over it. So, yeah, well, it was a great talk. Thanks. It was very interesting. So, and the comments by Marcelo made me aware that this idea, this kind of Kantian reading, it might be something, not Kantian reading, but let's say this Kantian question in the Tractatus might be something that has been going on for a while in the Wittgenstein interpretation. So perhaps you could just give a little more about the context of this reading, which for me seems a bit unnatural somehow, and especially because of the things you were presenting. Because I mean, so this idea that the I has no reference, or the idea that this idea that you presented as some kind of empty ego or something like this. This is a fairly common view, I believe, in many Austrian philosophers, such as Brentano, Marti, and probably that came through Wittgenstein. That came to Wittgenstein probably through the mediation of Bühler, who read Marti and was aware also of this tradition that the personal pronoun doesn't refer to anything. It's not a it is a syncategorematic term. It is not a categorematic term, right? So in this sense, it seems it seems to me that the way the Tractatus is formulated, I don't see where the Kantian or transcendental question comes out. It seems to me a fairly well accepted point that the I doesn't refer. If we place Wittgenstein, in this context of Austrian philosophy. So, yeah, well, what do you say about this?
Well, the way I started thinking about it is because I started from Frege. And Wittgenstein, of course, he read Frege and he read Russell. So the other ones are not as, let's say, in the years 1915, 1918, are not as present for him as Frege and Russell. And if you look at Frege, for example, he uses the I in order to explain the judgment stroke. So he has a certain knowledge of using the I where it is not part of what is described. But then, of course, if and that's of course not so common in Frege, then the question arises: what is this I in Frege if it's not empirical? Because nothing is described by the judgment stroke. And then when I proposed to call that a non-empirical subject, then people asked me, well, isn't that then the transcendental subject? And then you realize, yeah, of course, if they discuss their views with others, let's say when Wittgenstein was in the army with other people and all people read Kant, it was kind of common knowledge, then you can understand that it came in through that way, because there's also influence. Frege read also Kant. So, and Wittgenstein himself, well, let's say the prolegomena, it's not so clear. We don't have to talk about that because that's probably, let's say that he didn't read Kant. That makes it more easy. But then, but in the Grundlage, Frege is relating to Kant. So why not take the Kantian point of view here? Because I don't think that the Brentano school, well, there is some influence from the Brentano school if you read it at the beginning. The Meinungen objective becomes a state of affairs.
Right.
So there are certainly elements, but that's more where you see some form of logical realism at the beginning of the Tractatus. But then, of course, you come to the I and you wonder, what is that? And then if you then can connect it to his conception of language, then, yeah, it makes sense. Let's put it that way. But it does not fully make sense. I've also argued against reading it that way. It's not that read, I don't see the Tractatus as a Kantian work, not at all. Neither neo-Kantian nor Kantian. So it's something, it's a demon. Let's put it that way. So you have to overcome it. Because in the end, he's a realist. He says so himself. And Marcello argued for it, and rightly so. So, yeah, there is influence from the Brentano school, not from Brentano, but from the Brentano school, but rightly at the beginning. But not so much with the first person. I think that you have to think there about the role of the I in the explanation of the judgment stroke in Frege. That helped me, at least, to come to this reading of the Tractatus. But thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'd like to make a commentary on that. I don't know if you can listen. Is that okay? Because I suppose that the Kantian temptation in reading the Tractatus does not come primarily through the analysis of the first person, the emptiness of the subject, but comes from the possibility of supposing the book is asking for the transcendental conditions of language. Given language, how should be the word, how should be everything else, as if we have something given and ask about its transcendental conditions. And that's what I understand is undermined some way by the beginning of the book. Instead of being a plausible and very strong reading of the book and very strongly present in the books about Wittgenstein. And that's one of the reasons that I think we should take some care in using the expression transcendental subject, because it's Kantian. It's unavoidably Kantian. And saying that the subject plays a transcendental role in the Tractatus, I fully agree with that. If we define transcendental as what is not part of something, but as a condition of that, okay, that's a transcendental role. But for all the rest that Professor van der Schaar described, I do not suppose that I understand that we should avoid the possibility of projecting on Wittgenstein's subject the Kantian subject and the place of the Kantian subject has in Kantian philosophy and the tradition that follows it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Do you want to make some comments, Professor van der Schaar? Or?
No, it's fully understandable, that point. Yeah.
Well, so any more questions from our audience? Okay, Professor. Professor, you have another question.
So I take this opportunity to do some running, so this is not bad. No, I wanted also to ask you, because I mean, you characterize that as a first-person perspective involved in Wittgenstein's description, and then you developed a little bit on this. But what do you mean exactly by? Because I mean, under first-person perspective or first-person methodology, I mean, you have different people using that term. I mean, even at that, well, perhaps not at that time, but today at least, people will characterize descriptive psychology as a kind of first-person methodology, or people more in contemporary philosophy will use the term in the sense of, description of one's experiences in philosophy of mind, for example. But I mean, in Wittgenstein's case, in both cases that I mentioned, like descriptive psychology and contemporary philosophy of mind, I can kind of understand what that means. But in the case of Wittgenstein, that seems to be a bit different. So could you say perhaps a little bit more in contrast with these two examples that I just mentioned?
Yeah, thank you very much, Guillaume, because it's so different, because it has nothing to do with that you look inside. That's not what you do. Not, especially not. Yeah? So it's kind of opposed to that conception of first-person methodology, that you find the essences when you look inside and you make variations or things like that. The main idea is that you have to do something yourself when you do philosophy. If you want to understand something, it's not that somebody can come and give you certain proofs. You have to realize, okay, I see now the steps. Now I see it's a proof. It's a proof for me now. That element, the difference between having everything spelled out to you and having a whole textbook, and then you know about the subject, you can go to an exam and you can do the exam. It's not that. There is what you need is you need a certain form of understanding. So that is a typical, common way to understand what is typical of something that you have to do as a first person. And for Wittgenstein, I think that's the case for all philosophical questions. So you cannot understand what an internal relation is unless you see how it functions, because you can't express it. It's not something that's in the world, so you have to understand that, let's say, a name and an object, they come together to form a symbol. Because yes, that was more in the end, the main theme, although perhaps you have also something like that in a Kantian position, but the main theme was, Wittgenstein is proposing a new method, and it's very different from Russell's method, which tries, just as Hume would say things like, oh, but the spectator, he knows, David Hume, he knows that you are not free. You might think you're free, but the spectator knows better. So it's neither first-person methodology that you can look inside, nor is it the external point of view that if you're a spectator, you will better understand. It's something that you shouldn't be a spectator, you shouldn't have that distance, you should do it on your own account. And is this enough? What I've said? Does it help? I'd say does it help? Yeah,
absolutely, it's very helpful. But then there's something that I was wondering. I wanted also to ask, but then I forgot. And now what you say reminds me of this. It's about internal relations. You said, well, internal relations. So this is something you see. This is and you would explain so that we get knowledge of internal relations in that kind of I would say non-inferential knowledge kind of a position.
Non-propositional, yeah.
Oh, yeah, non-propositional. And then, but the example you used was, well, I don't know. It was not the example, but it was the adverb. You said, well, it's unthinkable that you would have this without having that. Okay, something like this. So the first person bit of the account, is it in that unthinkable, undenkbar? Yeah. Because we could also say it's impossible to have this without having this. I mean, it depends where you put the modality. Unthinkable, it's very psychological somehow. I would understand it as another way to say it's impossible to have, let's say, well, color and extension. Color and extension are in that kind of internal relation. It's impossible to have one without the other. Of course, you cannot think one without having the other, but perhaps you cannot think one without having the other because it is impossible to have one without the other.
Well, the point is, of course, that you can explain internal relations in terms of impossibility, but the Wittgenstein and Tractatus doesn't in terms of unthinkability. Mm-hmm. So why doesn't he use then impossibility? So that was something that I thought, well, maybe he just means that this I, the first person, you cannot think the one without the other. And for him, that also implies that's an impossibility, because these two, they come together. It's not a real distinction for him. But how do I know that there is an impossibility? Because I cannot think it. Well, at least that's how I read that passage. I tried to find his explanation of internal relation, and then I found it was in terms of unthinkability.
Okay, interesting. Okay, thanks a lot. That's very helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have another question based on the last words from Professor Marcelo. I was thinking, if we can't, for example, talk about a transcendental subject, it seems to me that we can talk about this first person methodology in singular. But is it still possible to think of this first person methodology in plural? For example, if you change this subject for an intersubject experience to the world, or would be, for example, just changing from the transcendental subject to a transcendental intersubjective. Does it mean a lot, for example, in this ontological description? I just want to hear a little bit about it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful, because I noticed also that Wittgenstein sometimes uses first person plural and sometimes first person singular. And at the beginning, he talks more about, of the Tractatus, talks more about first person plural, that it's our language. And then there comes a moment, then it becomes my language. So I thought about that, and my answer is, well, in between this first person plural and first person singular, you have these passages on essential and accidental features. So at the beginning, when Wittgenstein didn't make that distinction, it was just about our language, the language we speak. And then if you go deeper into Tractatus, he says, well, actually, I'm interested in these essential aspects of language. And that is something that all languages have in common. So I can just look at my own language, because if it's about the essence of language, then it's something that all languages have in common. We don't have to talk about we anymore. I can make it more simple. I can just speak about my language. That's the language I fully understand, because you never know precisely if you have a language that we in general speak, but my language I fully understand, is his idea. Yeah. So, and then he starts to speak about the singular. So there is a kind of development in the Tractatus, I think. But I'm not sure whether it really answered your question, because some people like Mary McGinn, they also speak about the neutral intersubjective world. So they have an idea of subjects who have all their perspective on the world, and if they come together and you have their languages together, then we would also have a kind of more objective world. But the way I understood the first person doesn't involve this kind of perspective. It's something that we, in certain sense, all share if you go to the essence of language, but it's non-empirical, so we don't differ there. It's all the same. There are not many first persons, because if you want to talk about numbers, you need to have a concept with content, so that you can distinguish the different objects and count them, let's say 5 tables. But you can't do that with first person, because it's not an empirical concept. It's not a concept.
Thanks a lot, Professor. Seems to me that the normativity, for example, from the shared experience comes from the intersubject experience to the world. So I can see, for example, how we would have this experience of truth with this first person based on my experience. For example, when we talk about the limits of the world being the limits of my language, the first person in singular, it seems to me that we wouldn't have the criterion of normativity that would, for example, give a constant meaning of truth to the reality. That's what I was thinking about. Thank you very much. I appreciate to hear a little bit more, but thanks a lot.
Shall I say something? Yeah, the normativity in the Tractatus. On the one hand, he doesn't want that to have it at all. That's quite clear. And it's because everything is already in order. So in a certain sense, the norm is already in the logic. And you can't have something that deviates from the norm, because as soon as you deviate, you have nonsense. It's nothing. So there's a special relation in the Tractatus between this logic and normativity. So if you take Frege or Russell, of course you have the logical laws, and then you can make mistakes, and you're still somehow making a judgment, but you're just guilty of not following the rules of logic. But you don't have that in the Tractatus. It's a logic. It's not a normative science in that sense. It's purely internal. As soon as you have your perspicuous language, nothing can go wrong. It's very, very special. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
No, I would like to say just that I fully agree with Professor van der Schaar, who I profited from reading her paper on the subject of today's talk beforehand, and to be transparent about that, at first the idea of a first-person methodology or first-person perspective raised some suspicion, but I should say I was fully convinced that, above all by your analysis of Wittgenstein's criticism of Russell's theory of judgment, and that's something really, I think, really relevant, understanding that judgment can be understood only from the first person, and that what Wittgenstein is contraposing to Russell is in fact a different perspective that refuses the idea that you can understand judgment from the third person perspective. And well, I said that when I said that I agree with the transcendental role. I fully agree. I understood that, and thank you for that. That was really interesting to see in your presentation. And as a result, to answer to Deborah, as a result, I also agree that there is no sense in the Tractatus of talking about us in this transcendental place. And above all, because of what Professor van der Schaar told, normativity is not a problem in the Tractatus. The order of language and the order of the word are given beforehand. That, I suppose, is the reason we can say the subject is empty, because it plays no role in determining normativity or making choices about rules or about other things that in Wittgenstein's later work, for example, occupy a central role. The way normativity refers to our particular actions, it's completely absent in here. And I suppose that the contrast between the philosophical investigations and the Tractatus here is also illuminating, because we understand that looking backward, what we see is Wittgenstein saying, well, I supposed in Tractatus that there was nothing here, and the real problem is how to understand normativity. It's central in his later work. I was just wanting to say that I profited a lot of your analysis on this subject, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very well. So if we have no more questions from the audience, okay, then I would like to thank Professor van der Schaar for being here with us, as well as Professor Marcelo for his comments. I would like to thank our audience here in the auditorium, as well as our online audience. And I would remind that our event goes throughout the entire week, and we will have an afternoon session today with talks by Professor Mario Porta, Professor Alice Serra, and Professor Gabriel Ferreira, which is not going to be transmitted online. It's going to be only in person here at PUC São Paulo, Auditorium 239. Thank you very much.
Thank you.